Thank you very much, Mr. Ginta, and thank you as well for your leadership and to all of the participants in this bipartisan special order to put a face on the heroin epidemic across the country. This evening, I rise as co-chair of the bipartisan task force to combat the heroin epidemic to join my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who have spoken to highlight the impact that this devastating impact has had in our home state of New Hampshire and all across the country. Just a few months ago, our task force held a similar special order to focus on the human aspects of this crisis and how it is affecting families and friends and colleagues in communities all across our districts. While the crisis has continued, the good news is that we are now making important progress toward a solution here in Congress. I'm appreciative of the important work that the Senate undertook in passing the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, and I want to thank Democratic and Republican leadership as well of the relevant committees for their hard work in recent weeks in bringing House legislation to the floor this week. But at the same time, I call upon my colleagues to ensure that this important work fulfills its intended purpose by providing the necessary assistance to treatment and recovery efforts that are so critical to responding to this crisis. Recently, in January, I spoke about my dear friend Chris' stepdaughter, Amber, who tragically died from an overdose after, excuse me, after a treatment bed was unavailable for her after leaving incarceration. This story, of course, illustrates the tragic consequences that limited treatment capacities can have for vulnerable members of our communities. Another heartbreaking story from my district involves Carl, the son of my constituent and good friend Sue Messenger. At 24 years old, Carl had been using heroin on and off for about a year before he finally approached his parents to talk about his addiction. To put it simply, his parents were stunned. Carl was a recent college graduate who earned good grades and had his eyes set on applying to dental school. It was almost inconceivable to them that such a high-achieving young man could fall victim to opioid addiction. But as they learned that day, and as we all now know too well, there is no one face of addiction. After discussing his addiction at length with his parents and asking for their help and support as he began his journey to recovery, Carl's parents were able to secure him a place at a detox program over 50 miles away from home, the only one that would take him as a cash-paying client because their insurance would not cover an opioid detox program. 6 days later, Carl successfully completed the detox and was discharged to return home to his parents. Over the next several weeks, Carl continued on his road to recovery. He passed every drug test and remained resolutely committed to avoiding all drugs and alcohol. His family was so pleased to see him getting better with each and every day. But when Carl came down with an upper respiratory infection shortly thereafter, a fatal error occurred in treating the infection. Unaware of Carl's history of addiction and his recent completion of detox, the doctor who saw Carl for his respiratory infection prescribed Cherituxin AC syrup, a narcotic cough suppressant. Triggered by the codeine in the cough syrup, Carl's addiction to heroin was instantly reawakened. And when Carl could resist the craving no longer, he decided to inject heroin. The substance he injected, however, was pure fentanyl, 50 times more powerful than heroin, and he died of an overdose in his family home. There were no labels on the bottle that indicated the cough medicine could trigger such drug-seeking behavior, and Carl or his parents to know that his cough medicine could pose such a fatal danger. Since his death, his mother, Sue, has spoken out about the need to reform labeling requirements to make sure that no other family has to endure what she has had to live through. Carl was an educated, kind, driven young man who came from a supportive family, and this tragedy could occur to anyone. The tragedy of Carl's story is why I was proud to help introduce Jesse's Law. Sponsored by Representative Wahlberg, this bill will seek to ensure that medical professionals have full knowledge of a patient's previous opioid addiction. It seeks to do this by requiring the Secretary of Health and Human Services to develop standards for the prominent display of a patient's history of opioid addiction in their medical records when those patients consent to include that information, and by ensuring that the information can more easily be shared among providers with consent. While this legislation was only recently introduced and is not included in the current package of bills, I'm hopeful we can work on a bipartisan basis to bring this important bill to the House, to the floor before the end of this session. I'm very pleased with the legislation we're considering this week that will have a measurable impact to move the needle in fighting this epidemic. Among the 15 bills on the floor this week, half are part of the legislative agenda developed by the Bipartisan Task Force to combat the heroin epidemic that I started with my colleague, Congressman Ginta. Additionally, provisions of several other bills are included in legislation being considered, so this week represents truly important progress in the House. It's critical that those who have engaged in this fight against the epidemic continue to press on in our efforts to include critical financial assistance for prevention, treatment, and recovery in our final bill. As we reflect tonight on those we have lost to this epidemic, those who are still fighting it, let us continue to focus to ensure our communities have the help that they need to put this crisis behind us. Again, thank you to all of our colleagues who are working